At the dawn of the 1970s, the car market was changing forever. Manufacturers were experimenting with styling and engineering, the roots forming for what we expect from cars even today, most notably in the creation of the Supermini segment. And in 1972, one of the most interesting, most stylish and most successful new Superminis would rear its head, the indefinably chic Renault 5. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you'd like to cosplay as a cut-price Jean Ragnotti, then please do follow the link in the description. But 53 years ago, at the end of 1971, when this car was first shown, there was no accepted recipe for how to design and build a Supermini. For Renault, the Cinq was something completely new, an all-new genre of small car. So to learn where it all came from, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. I find it a crying shame, but I don't think it would be too controversial to float the idea that the Supermini market is dying. But 50 years ago, in the mid-1970s, it was not only the fastest growing segment in Europe, but also the most competitive. Yet in those early years, no one was really sure how one should look, leading to a huge amount of experimentation, our starting point lying in 1969 with the Autobianchi A112. This little fella is almost forgotten today, and that's scarcely believable as they sold well over 1 million units, but it was engineered by the legendary Dante Giacosa. Autobianchi was then a subsidiary of Fiat, used really as the testbed for new or niche ideas. And it was Giacosa's Autobianchi Primula which set the template for the modern small car. Back in 1963, it featured a transverse engine, with its gearbox on the end driving the front wheels. But probably just as importantly, it boasted a hatchback, meaning that as a cut-down version, the A112 was possibly the first true Supermini. Certainly only a couple of years later, it birthed the Fiat 127, a car sold nearly 8 million times. With the two Italians, the Renault 5 and of course the Peugeot 104, the Supermini had become a force. And in the following years, we'd see the likes of Volkswagen and Ford join the party, but Renault were there from the beginning. Our little blue friend here rearing its head only months after the 127 and almost a year before the Peugeot. But of course, these four can all trace their heritage back to 1959. And naturally, this car is why we refer to the Supermini as the Supermini. But we've told this story about 1 billion times before on TwinCam, so the card in the corner will have to suffice. Add in the likes of the rear-engined Hillman Imp, and if we x-ray them all, we see 4 totally different ways of achieving small car perfection. But I'm afraid to say that this discussion is by no means over, because mini cars were not the only cheap cars on offer, and here's where the French really come in as we jump back to 1948. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the Fourth Republic was desperate for an all-new and truly modern, tough, cheap and practical people's car, and its name was the Citroën 2CV. From a maintenance perspective, the Deux Chevaux made Meccano look like rocket science, its slide-away body panels and air-cooled engine proving easier to repair than a popped fuse, all while its rack and pinion steering, inboard front brakes and ingenious interconnected suspension made it ride and handle like no cheap car had ever done before. Sure, the 2CV felt every penny of its cost-cutting, but that made it focused on the task in hand, and it infused the car with character. Even today, 76 years on, if you wish to make it clear that you are in France, then all you have to do is place a tin snail in the background. Between 1948 and 1990, including the Diane, Citroën produced over 6.8 million examples, but it certainly wasn't without its rivals, principal among which only came along in 1961, the Fifth Republic state-owned car maker, bringing us the Renault 4. This new, if similarly ugly, family car went about achieving its goals in a very different manner to the Citroën, but it was still beautifully utilitarian, and it was a fair chunk more capable than its old rival, what with a 13-year advantage. So being built through to 1992, Renault pumped out over 8 million cars, a figure that not only eclipses the 2CV, but makes our old friend the Mini look quaint by comparison. It's now a bit of a cliche for us to begin almost randomly discussing the Mini, but everything the Renault 5 became was first defined by Alec Izagonis. Because Bernard Danon, Renault's then head of planning, foresaw the birth of the Supermini, coming round at the height of the R4's powers, proclaiming the R5 to be the car for all seasons. Just like its older brothers and sisters, it would have to be tough and utilitarian, but in order to succeed in the way it eventually did, it would also have to become effortlessly chic. Chic in a manner that still, some 53 years on, isn't quite definable. So I think that's where we should begin. Not necessarily with the styling of this car, but with its attitude and the society in which it was born. Anon's idea to expand Renault's small car range was a masterstroke, immediately securing sales figures that most other manufacturers could never have dreamed of. But as I said, it all stemmed from the mind of Sir Alec Izagonis. Back in the late 1950s, as the Mini was being developed, cheap cars really came in two flavours: practical or small. In the former camp is the 2CV and the R4, both of which were really quite large, while in the latter we found bubble cars like the Isetta and the Messerschmitt KR. Sir Alec's bright idea was to replace the bubble cars with a proper car, one that would transport 4 passengers in refinement and safety. Of course, Izagonis managed all that by creating the template that Dante Giacosa would then develop, most importantly with a transverse engine. But that didn't matter to the average consumer, and what they were met with was truly novel. In 1959, the Mini looked and felt weird, and being only 10 feet long, a lot of people were turned off by the idea of being seen in something so petite. The thing to remember is that the Mini's now timeless style was a total accident. Izagonis was not a stylist, and his single-minded approach terminally affected his later work, leading directly to both his forced retirement and a fair chunk of the turmoil that Austin Morris later faced. The Mini took time to grow into its skin. With the racing success came pedigree, and with celebrity owners came a classless image, building up to the iconic status it holds today, as well as that all-important adjective, chic. The Mini was accidentally chic, and it was an engineering-led, customer-effacing small car, but the arguably even chicer Renault 5 was to be conservatively engineered as the work of a proper stylist, the brilliant yet tragic Michel Boue. Working in Renault's styling department, Boue was only in his mid-30s when, in 1967, he heard murmurs about the project that would grow to define his work. With an appetite for something new, he went home and worked after hours, unbeknownst to anyone else, placing on his drawing board the platform of the existing Renault 4. Atop it, he then sketched the silhouette of a 3-door hatchback, a shape unlike anything Renault had ever built before. And once made aware, those above knew it was right. At its heart, the Renault 5 is strikingly simple. In this sense, it displays an immediate contrast to its contemporaries, the Mini, the 127, etc., as it pays clear homage to the R4 in its lofty stance and slab-like appearance. Certainly, there's none of the inbuilt beefiness of a Mini. Instead, the R5 is delicate, shallow-rooted and sits almost like a weeble. But the raking and supreme cleanliness in its silhouette gives it a progressive nature, and its real beauty is in the unparalleled detailing. First, however, we need to address that progressiveness, because it's easy for us to think, even knowing the era from which this car hails, that this is just how small cars looked. But I'm here to tell you that the early 70s was still the era of tail fins, of circular headlamps and of chrome bumpers, all things the Renault 5 shuns. Placed beside an A112 or an early 127, this car looks far more radical, more avant-garde and more timeless. Then there's the simple layout of the body, because a feature I feel so many people disregard when discussing this car is the simple fact that it's a 3-door hatchback. Starting with the hatchback part, and in spring 1972, when the R5 first appeared in dealers, small hatchbacks were a rarity. Sure, you could buy an A112, but that had a very, very high load lip, and an early 127 was only available as a saloon. And the Peugeot 104 was a saloon. And that means that with the now standard ability to just load it up to the roof and to fold down the seats and treat it like a van, the Renault 5 was novel, bringing the practicality of the Renault 4 down into the now blossoming Supermini segment. What's also noteworthy is the 3-door part, because within the French motor industry specifically, having only 2 side doors was unusual. Naturally, I can put you in the direction of either the 2CV or the Renault 4, but more crucially, we find the Peugeot 104, not only initially found as a saloon, but a 4-door saloon at that. The point is that these 2 French Superminis gave the average consumer a clear perspective of who each car was for. The Peugeot was considered upmarket compared to the Renault, and we'll see that reflected in the prices shortly. But the body style made it also appear more sensible. It was certainly more conservative, and its extra side doors made it the choice for a family. The Renault 5, on the other hand, was inherently more youthful in its appearance, and thanks to its lack of doors, was the choice for individuals. In a sense, the Peugeot was a luxury, while the Renault was a tool. So on to the detailing, and clearly Boue was working in a very narrow gap. The wheelbase, the suspension, the engine and the gearbox were all preset, so couldn't be moved around. And with the tailgate requiring as much width and depth as possible, it would have been very easy to end up with a car that either looked like a box or one that looked like the old Renault 4. Now fair enough, there are ounces of both sat deep within the design of the Renault 5, but the surfacing is so elegant, minimalist too, and feeding into that are the hidden door handles and flush-fitting plastic bumpers. It would take until the mid-1980s for everyone else to finally copy this, in which time the individuality of the Renault 5 enamored it to millions. At the back, the slender rear lamps sit right on the corners of the tailgate, the cabin vents up high to give it depth. And then at the front, as I mentioned, flush-fitting square headlamps were not the norm. In fact, this was the part of the car that seems to have taken longest to develop, Boue filing through dozens of variations before getting to this friendly face. And back in the early 70s, with such an unusual lack of chrome, the Renault 5 was very friendly indeed. Feeding out of its face and into the flanks, that swage line traverses the front wheel arch before flattening out the profile and the rear wheel arch. It's a masterpiece of industrial simplicity, and though its face took a little while to come out, some of Boue's earliest sketches show us exactly what we eventually met. Inside too, the theme continues immaculately. the sheer simplicity of the trim proving once again that style is not defined by flashiness. But again, modernity is all here, safety being considered arguably more than in any other car of its size. The dashboard is padded to reduce glare and facial injuries, while the steering column is collapsible. Plus, these chunky inner wings have crumple zones built in. Otherwise, however, the Renault 5 is everything you need, and though this early TL shuns all you don't, that sense of style enamored it later into being probably the best equipped small car you could buy. When you place such beautifully delicate and deliberate detailing within the frame of something so simple and so unashamed in its purpose, you create something that lives. Something with such individuality and character that it becomes classless, timeless, and the kind of car that owners give names to. As far as I can tell, the Renault 5 is the only first-generation Supermini that managed to wholly emulate the styling personality of the Mini. And as an aside, I think it was the only small car to do so until Renault managed it again with the original Twingo. If there's one indicator as to the success of Michel Boue's work, it's that it worked just as well as a battered farmyard tool as it did ferrying models from photoshoot to photoshoot. So we're clear that the R5 was a stylistic departure, relating itself to the chic of a Mini but thoroughly modernising the small car segment. Yet under the skin, cars like the Mini, the 127 and the 104 were mechanically radical, most notably with their transverse engines, but in the case of the Austin and Peugeot, sump-mounted gearboxes. Items that were not the best either for refinement or reliability. But of course, being based on the platform of the Renault 4, the 5 is front-wheel drive, yes, but it goes about achieving it in a totally different manner. Doing things differently appears to be the default setting for the French, but they were old hands at front-wheel drive, the likes of the Citroën Traction Avant, wonder what that means, showcasing the tech back in 1934. Naturally, the 2CV also pulled itself along, and the Renault 4 duly followed suit. Biancour's effort marking a departure from their rear-engine tradition. But unlike the New Guard and their transverse engines, the French were used to longitudinally mounted engines. Now, with the gearbox in its natural position on the end of the engine, logic dictates that you should keep it clear of the passenger cell. After all, the goal is superior packaging, but having the engine hanging out beyond the front wheels leads to obscene understeer and a huge front overhang. Just see any classic Audi for evidence of that. The lesser of evils was therefore technically a mid-engine layout. The power unit gouging a hole in the bulkhead, the gearbox mounted up front, and the engine ancillaries confusingly mounted on the clutch end of the engine. It's all wrong, but as I said, this was both cheaper and more reliable than a transverse layout. And of course, it's technically mid-engined, so the Renault 5's weight distribution is better than any of its peers. Now, a basic Renault 5L came with a teeny tiny 782cc Biancourt engine. Now, we in the UK never got that power unit. We had a larger 845cc version as our base model Renault 5. But the vast majority of 5s came fitted with Renault's faithful old Clé-en-Font engine. Now, the Biancourt was a really old-fashioned engine dating back to 1948. And the Biancourt, though far more modern and with an aluminium cylinder head, was still a decade old by the time the Renault 5 was launched. Yet with its aluminium cylinder head and its quite unburstable nature, you could still find it in normal European Renaults all the way through to the late 1990s in the Clio and the Twingo, and even in Dacias through to 2004. So of course, that engine is what this car has at 956cc and producing about 44 brake horsepower. Now, that is decent for the time period. Nothing hugely to write home about, but that's more than a Mini 1000 made with, 42cc more, although it is such a tiny amount, that difference. But my impression of this engine is that it's quite thrashy. It's an old overhead valve design, and it feels like it. It's all torquey, it's all kind of down low, the power band. But it pulls us along more than well enough. It's just nothing necessarily to write home about. So the general refinement of this car is about what you'd expect. It's a tin can from the early 1970s with quite a thrashy engine, if I'm honest. But the fact that it's high torque means that you don't need to change gears all that often. It means that you can start from down low and just expect it to give you the power virtually from idle. And so it's a really, really flexible power unit, and that means that you don't need to get the engine spinning at massive revs in order to, really make progress. So I can change into fourth gear here, and I'm just doing about 30 miles per hour. And it's perfectly refined, and that's the beauty of these old overhead valve power units, that they don't require the revs. You can just demand it wherever, so they are incredibly flexible, even if they don't have a huge amount of overall power. What I really do like, however, is the gear change. Now, early Renault 5s, in fact, I'm not 100% sure, I think it was the 5L, had a dash-mounted gear change, and the 5TL, like this car, did not. So this is only a car from 1974. I don't know when they phased out the dash change, but I think all TLs came with a floor-mounted change instead. So the dash change goes over the engine. Just while I figure out where I'm going, the dash change goes through the dashboard into the engine bay and then over the engine down into the top of the gearbox, which of course is right at the front of the car. Now, this car with a floor change has to do its linkage differently. If it wants to be traditional with a gear lever on the floor, you're not going to be able to go over the engine. So I believe they use cables instead, and I'm really impressed with the quality of this gear change. It's not, hugely precise. It's not really tight either. So I've never driven a left-hand drive car before, so it feels a little bit strange doing this. I'm trying not to open the door, but despite using the wrong arm to be changing gear, I really, really like this gearbox. I'm surprised at it because I expected it to be a bit rubbish, frankly, the gearbox, but it just isn't. And so, although you don't need to change gears all that often, thanks to the flexibility of the engine, I'm enjoying doing it nonetheless. But we're not here to be disappointed, because don't forget, of course, the Renault 5 TS. Expanded to 1289cc and fed by a Weber carburettor, the TS gifted us 64 brake horsepower. And in 1975, let's say, 64 brake horsepower in a car of this size was quite a lot. It was more than a Mini 1275 GT, and you could argue that the Renault 5 was the first hot hatch Supermini, when in early 76 we met the Alpine, or Gordini in the UK, with 93 brake horsepower to play with. Then there was the Alpine Turbo of the early 80s, lumping us up further to 110 brake horsepower, hot off the back of the pedigree generated by Jean Ragnotti in his mid-engined silhouette rally car. That's certainly the subject of a different video, but I wanted to mention it because the Renault 5 Turbo was my dream car as a child. Growing up in the mid-2000s, you can forget your Enzos and the like. A small French box with ridiculous Gandini-styled arches and an engine where the rear seat should be is very much where it was at. Coming back down to earth, however, and the R5's suspension was, of course, just like the R4's. In chasing the ride comfort of the 2CV back in 1961, Renault fitted the car with all-round torsion bar suspension. Not a torsion beam as seen in many more modern small cars, this was fully independent, and it was both incredibly compact and lent itself to enormous suspension travel. The two front bars are mounted longitudinally under the floor, while the rears are transverse, famously giving all Renaults of this era a wheelbase around an inch shorter on the near side, the bars naturally having to be offset from each other. What makes the R5 so much more refined and so much more accomplished than its father, however, is the monocoque construction. Now, Renault had a long history of unitary body shells, but abandoned it all with the launch of the 4 for the sake of cost. Now, however, it was back with the 5, and taken all together, built up into something unique and brilliant. So we have torsion bars all around, and let's tackle that first through the ride quality, because I've never driven a small car with this much suspension travel. Modern manufacturers and their quest for absolutely zero travel and for zero roll are just getting it wrong. Embrace the body roll. That's what the French did back in the 60s and 70s, and it means that this car just leans into the corners. If you've ever seen any clips of Renault 5s going around a track, then you'll have seen just how on the door handles they end up. So it looks comical, but the ride quality is just to die for. It's incredible. There are speed bumps on this road that, as I've been speaking this, we've been going over. One just there. You can hear them and you can see them, but you just can't feel them. The suspension damps everything out so incredibly well. I am so impressed with the way this car rides, and that's in spite of me coming here with high expectations for it. You know, cars like this are known for having brilliant ride quality, so why would I come in here expecting anything less? Yet, I'm still shocked at just how good it is. So the torsion bars are mounted transversely at the back, and they're on trailing arms, which is pretty standard for small car suspension, but it gives decent enough geometry. On the flip side, the front torsion bars have double wishbones attaching them to the wheels. And double wishbones in this kind of layout is quite unusual for a front-wheel drive car, because usually you have a transverse engine. But with all the extra space, you can incline the shock absorbers within the double wishbones. And so you end up with really sophisticated suspension geometry. Double wishbones are kind of the gold standard for road car suspension, and so though the springing mechanism with the torsion bars is quite unusual, otherwise the double wishbones are exactly what you would want for sheer driving pleasure. So this car has an aftermarket Mountney smaller steering wheel. The original one's in the boot. I don't know why it's not being refitted, quite frankly, but hey, here we are. And that does make the steering a bit heavier than it should be, so I'm not really going to comment on that. Certainly once you get going, it lightens up nicely and there's no problems whatsoever. So what that means is that we have a generally unusual springing mechanism in the torsion bars, allied to the best road car suspension you can get, really, within reason. And that means that it has a weird compromising character between this brilliant ride quality, that fabulously roly-poly appearance these have. Honestly, one of the best ride qualities, well, the best ride quality of any small car I've ever driven, no matter what age. This is the best. But it allies that to this uncanny handling ability that you really need to gain confidence in order to extract from it, because you're sat here and you think the car's going to roll over, but then you push on that little bit more and you realise that, so it has this ability just to kind of cling on and go exactly where you go in spite of the body trying to go elsewhere. It's just fabulously unusual and so unique. There's a pattern to pedaling a Renault 5. It's like playing in a band. You've got to kind of fall into the rhythm. And falling into the rhythm of this car means you avoid sudden movements. You don't suddenly adjust the steering mid-corner. Instead, what you do is you choose your angle, you apply slowly, carefully, and then it takes you where you want to go. You kind of learn to stay in time with the body roll. And one other thing I've noticed about this car actually is that it's only one of 2 small cars I've ever driven of any kind, the other being a hydrolastic Mini, not a Cone Mini, only a hydrolastic Mini, that when you enter a corner, and in Britain you're bound to enter a corner and find ridges or potholes in the middle of that corner. When you hit those holes in most cars, or those ridges, you end up skating slightly across the road. So let's say on this left-hander we're coming up to, you hit the holes in the middle and you skirt out to the right-hand side slightly. But this Renault 5 doesn't do that. You hear the pothole or the ridge. You feel it slightly. But then in the end, it just tracks straight in its original trajectory. This car is spooky in a number of ways because it's so unlike everything we're used to. But that just unique nature is so endearing today. The engine, as I said, is nothing really to write home about, and the fact we've got that massive bulge in the middle means that I imagine a British market right-hand drive car will have nowhere to put your left foot. But that's okay for me in this left hooker at least. But the manner in which this car drives, that just unique nature of it, the fact it feels so unlike everything else, allied to that style, I love these. I love them to bits. Can someone please, maybe please, bankroll me? Bankroll me, please, for a nice Gordini. So what lies before us is a small car that nailed its brief in terms of styling and image. It also drove phenomenally well, but what's often forgotten is that thanks to its largely pre-existing platform, it did not cost Renault all that much to productionise. As a result, a Renault 5L would have set you back £854. For context, the almighty Fiat 127 was up at £919. Sure, a Mini 1000 easily undercut both at only 797 quid, but British Leyland were famously underselling the car, and while it continued to sell fabulously in Britain, the European market saw the Mini quickly fall away as it aged beside its hatchback-bodied successors. But just to blow all else into the weeds, the Peugeot 104, the R5's compatriot, cost a staggering £1,194. So back to the little Renault, and built into that very affordable price could be a couple of niceties that would help make it both a better car and would maintain its modern character for longer. What made it a better car was the all-round torsion bar suspension. Yes, we've already discussed this, but serious thought was given to a cheaper beam axle, something Fiat, Volkswagen and Ford would all later use, lumbering their cars with harsher rides. The Renault, on the other hand, embraced its roly-poly, but probably better compromise. And what kept it looking fresh was what brought the styling together in the first place, the plastic bumpers. Now, if the R5 had used chrome bumpers, it would undoubtedly have needed a facelift like the Fiat did. But in 1972, these polyurethane-coated bumpers were expensive. Yet they were worth their initial outlay not only in the rush towards modernity, but also for their self-healing properties, something a French made very good use of. But this wouldn't be a proper twin cam video without just an ounce of controversy, and for once it has nothing to do with the car itself. Instead, Renault took this opportunity to task Michel Boue himself with updating and simplifying their famous rhombus shape emblem, this being the final product. Sure, it may have lacked a little in character, but what spoiled the party were the court proceedings. You see, this new badge had been in use since July 1971, but with the media surrounding Renault through the winter and into the following year, a chemicals manufacturer called Kent began to take notice, and as you'll be able to tell, weren't best pleased with Biancor's new trademark. The result was not only a slap on the wrist, but also a recall, attempting to bring in every car sold with the forbidden badge, replacing them with a new one, lashed up in about 25 minutes by Jean-Pierre Vasoli. But it seems he did a fine job, because over 50 years later, its general shape remains. What this means, however, is that if you manage to find a Renault 5, a Renault 15 or a Renault 17 with the Kent-style badge, then you're sitting on something obscenely rare that only about 3 people in the world actually care about, myself included. But if you were to kindly rewind your video cassettes, you'll remember that I described Michel Bouet's story as tragic. And that's because he was only in his 30s when he worked on his masterpiece. Yet only months after its launch, at the end of 1972, he died of cancer. He may have lived to see its launch and its immediate praise, but he never got to witness what happened next. The following year, in 1973, the Western world was plunged into the oil crisis. The fallout of the Yom Kippur War and OPEC's oil embargo forced fuel prices through the roof, leading to shortages and a huge downturn in the car market. Manufacturers were left scrambling to market the hell out of their small, fuel-efficient cars. Renault, as a twist of fate, finding themselves in the land of milk and honey, the Renault 5 practically selling itself. Not only did it look brand new, but at motorway speeds it was more secure and more refined than almost anything else, while for a period being Europe's most fuel-efficient car. These factors all coming together, people now willing to downsize into a Supermini, and shocking absolutely nobody, the R5 stormed into pole position as France's most popular new car, a place it would retain for most of its life. When a new car is launched, it tends to rise to popularity only to fall off after a few years and eventually be replaced. And when the Renault 5 was introduced to dealers in the spring of 1972, it was a moderate success. Renault were initially fearful that it might alienate buyers, what with its 3-door layout appearing too utilitarian, but they needn't have worried. In that first year, they managed to sell over 100,000 units. Then they sold over 200,000 units in 73, over 300,000 units in 74, and by 1976, they were selling over 400,000 of these little cars per year. Then, with a mild facelift, a new dashboard, an automatic gearbox, and of course a 5-door model, sales rose to over 700,000 cars per year in 1980. If the R5 had emulated the styling success of the Mini, then the additions of the Alpine and of course the Turbo helped match it for pedigree as well. By the time production ended in 1984, they built over 5.5 million of them. And the greatest kind of distinction of its success is the fact that the new Renault 5, launched in that year, despite being an all-new car under the skin, still looked eerily and brilliantly like the Michel Boue original. The Renault 5 dictated a new future for small cars. It dictated how small cars would have to feel, how they'd have to perform, and of course, how they'd have to look, to a whole new generation of cars coming through, all the way through to today. And of course, in the modern world, Renault are trying it all over again. So may the electric Renault 5 save the Supermini segment itself. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.